Hello and welcome to Winning Strategies, Submitting a Grant Application. Today is the third of four webinar sessions of the Winning Strategies series. So today we will be focusing on the process of writing and submitting a grant application, as well as the important considerations to try and increase your chances of funding. So we'll get started right away. So my name is Patrick Ferrand. I'm the Bilingual Ottawa Program Manager at ACFO Ottawa. So my email is ottawabilingue@acfoottawa.ca. My phone number is on the screen as well. So if you guys have any questions about the program, about today's webinars, about possible funding opportunities, feel free to write to me, to give me a call. I'd be very happy to answer all of your questions as well as possible. So moving forward, what is the Bilingual Auto Program? Since I have you here, I'll do a quick spiel. We did mention it quite a bit in the last two webinars, so I'll give different details today. So it's really just a micro grant program with two types of projects. So we have the activation projects up to $10,000. Those are specifically for nonprofits and private businesses. And then the propulsion projects up to $20,000. That is only for nonprofit organizations. There will be a new round of funding in April this year. And in 2021, we managed to give out about $485,000. So we're hoping to have a similar amount in this upcoming round. And in the last year, we managed to reach 33% of the population of Ottawa. So that was a really great number for us, and we hope to keep bumping up those numbers. So just a quick view of what we're going to be going over today. So we talked about the Bilingual Auto Program. We'll do a quick recap of the first two webinars that already passed. And then we'll go into the real meat of the subject, which is the 10 steps of applying for a grant. And then I'll just quickly mention what the next webinar will be about. So if we go back on the first two webinars, they were developing a project idea as well as developing a financial calendar and budget for your project. So those are both available on YouTube now. The first one, we really talked about targeting a public and having an intention for your project. We talked about aiming for quality impact. We discussed developing your concept as well as how to establish partnerships and how to retain participation in your events. And then we discussed very, very briefly about funding. But in the second webinar, we really went into depth about the different types of funding that are available. What's the pertinence of having a budget and financial calendar, how to develop your budget, as well as talking about funding with different and various funders. So if you haven't seen those, I'd suggest you go and check those out on YouTube. They're still available and they should stay there for a while. So feel free to go review those. So today's stuff is really the 10 steps of applying for a grant. So l'AFO, which is the Assemblée de la Francophonie de l'Ontario, which is the Assembly of Francophones in Ontario, as well as other experts have recommended the following steps within a specific timeline to fill out a grant application. So the 10 steps are determining your eligibility, establishing a work plan, testing a project idea, making sure you contact the funder, writing the application, collaboration, budget, reviewing your project, submitting the application, and then following up. So it can seem like a lot, but you'll see as we go through them, it works itself out, and it's pretty easy to run through once you use these steps. So if we start with the first one, it's determining your eligibility. So it's really crucial to make sure that you're eligible for the funding to avoid wasting time. Make sure your organization or your project is admissible. So to do so, confirm the type of organization that have been funded or that will be funded. You want to make sure you validate the accepted funded expenses and revenues. You also want to identify the projects that would be a good fit with the program. So in the first few webinars, we discussed a bit about having ideas, maybe putting them on a shelf with a bunch of different project ideas. Now's a good time to go through those projects and figure out which ones are eligible for the funding that you are looking at. We move on to the second, which is establishing a work plan. So creating a timeline will allow you to properly accomplish each step. So having that plan is really essential. So you can start off by signing up or registering for the application portal if necessary, and start by uploading the necessary documentation, your bylaws, your letters patents, your financial statements. Getting all of that boring stuff out of the way right away helps you also have an idea of what's left to be done to properly establish your work plan. And then with the help of a planning tool, maybe a team or a consultant, you want to make a written plan to write and review your application. Then we move on to testing the project idea. It's number 3. So you want to start to develop your project idea by consulting successful projects in other regions. Sometimes someone else has done a similar project, and you can maybe exchange ideas on how to ameliorate or how to fix maybe certain issues that they had. You can also check the list of previously funded projects. You can also review your strategic plan or other studies on your target population. That will give you a good idea of what is maybe a recognized need in the community. And again, through consultation with your community on their needs. So that's a great way to making sure that your project is pertinent and will be well received by the community in which you're trying to place it. It would also be interesting to test it by discussing with teammates, members of the community, consults, or even funders. You can contact the funder and see what they have to say about your project. Sometimes they'll have a bit of input that can help you develop to the next step. You can also look for guidance for developing your project through the required fields. So a lot of different funding opportunities will have a guide or fields that you want to try and respect when you're planning your project. So these two boxes on the left are really specific to the Bilingual Ottawa program. So you can see here that we have our 4 fields would be vitality, inclusion, community economic development, as well as building bridges. So sometimes you want to see how your project can fit inside one of those boxes, as well as maybe required fields for the community in which you are working. So on the right here, this third box is really the strategic community plans from AFO, again, the Francophone Assembly of Ontario. And these are fields to increase the general bilingualism and French rights in Ontario. So this is a really good guide for this type of program, for example. There's also a way to look outwards than just in the program for inspiration. So for example, these are 17 sustainable development goals that have been set up by the United Nations. And they help as a base, as ideas to develop a project that will have an impact and that is worthy of funding on the long term. Even if these might not respond to the fields that are presented in a program, if you touch to one of these 16 goals, it will be noted by your funder. They will notice that you're trying to improve your community, you're trying to have a sustainable development, and that will be to your advantage in almost any context. Next, you want to establish a tangible project idea. So you have to be able to, funders have to be able to easily see the potential of your project in its delivery. So you want to make sure the program is simple with concrete steps that you can put in place. You want to concentrate on the actions that you will be taking instead of developing why those actions will be taken. The why is important, but there is no why without the how. So it's really important to know how you're going to get this done. And then the project must also be sustainable and generate direct participation. So if your project has direct participation, it will increase your funding chances. You also want to try and mitigate your risk factors. So anticipate any obstacles or propose maybe concrete actions that could solidify the project on a long-term basis. Next, you need to resume your idea and prepare your pitch. So this is also a very important part. So to properly test your project idea, you have to be able to present it in a really efficient way. So you want to practice that, make sure it's simple, it's clear, it's convincing, but it's also inviting to your project. So present your project in 1 or 2 sentences. Your project that will present the product, in 1 or 2 sentences at most. You have to be able to explain what will be delivered, what will be received. And you also want to try to write a quick description of the context that led to the creation of the project with a few key details. So that will also help you and your team stay focused on where you want to get with this project. And then you want to construct 2 or 3 key performance indicators. That will also help you right off the bat know what kind of project you're creating and how you want to go and compile the information. Following that, you want to make a quick estimate of the expenses and the revenues that will make the project possible. Next up, number 4, contacting the funder. So it's important to establish a connection with the program manager to validate and direct your program idea. So there's multiple ways of doing this. You can try and participate in workshops or webinars that they might be offering. You could have an in-depth read of the application guide that they would have. You can contact a program agent to book a phone call or maybe obtain some type of feedback. But generally, any kind of feedback you can get from the funder is very important. And following that, you want to make concrete modifications to your project to show the funder that you're listening, that you want to improve on the recommendations. So that's also a very important point before submitting your application. Next up is writing the application. So this part takes the most time, but it's also the most important. So like the entire presentation of your project will depend on the writing of your application. You have to be efficient in your choice of words. You have to properly communicate the idea and the steps and the impact of your project. It has to be clear in writing, because the jury will base themselves on the text that they receive, on the application, and not on what's been imagined, not what's been discussed. Unfortunately, the jury can only base themselves on what they have in front of them. So you have to make sure that your idea is clear and concise and written. And then to make sure you don't spend too much time, you want to stick to your plan. Have a predetermined plan on where your project's going. When we're writing our projects, we can easily get sidetracked and go on a few tangents. So by sticking to your plan, it'll help you reduce the wasted time in this process. And then you want to present your impact. So you want to be clear and consistent in your targets and your objectives that you're aiming for. So you can start by estimating the number of direct and indirect participants, and then using whichever is a higher number as your path to present the results. So you want to try and keep the presentation simple, but without exaggerating. The impact should be significant without being overly ambitious. So again, staying in a reasonable range, but you still want to have a high impact. So you still want to aim for those amounts. Be precise in the delivering of your project and the affected participants, how you're going to be delivering the project. And make sure you demonstrate the link between your project and the mission of your organization. Sometimes certain organizations might not see themselves as potential people to receive funding simply because their mission of their organization might not fit. However, you can have a project that will fit and link both, that will allow you to go and develop your organization to another degree. After that, you kind of want to evaluate the scope of your project. So there are two types of projects, and they both have their own advantages and disadvantages. So you can concentrate on their strengths. So here we're talking about quantitative or qualitative projects. So if your project tends to lean more one way than the other, make sure you try and concentrate on that side. And if it is balanced, you want to try and work into it. You want to try and find a good balance between both the quantitative and qualitative impacts that you will be able to create. So when we're talking about quantitative, we're really talking about the bigger impact and the big results without exaggerating. We want to talk about the promotional and geographical impact of the project. And we have to have a project, even if it's very large, it can't be empty of impact. The impact still needs to be present. And then if we're talking about qualitative projects, well, we want to point a bit more to the quality of service being offered, the social change that we will be bringing. You can also talk about the results that will be attained since there's a more direct participation. And you also want to make sure you don't ignore to promote the created projects, even though it's qualitative project. And then performance indicators. So these performance indicators are really measurable results that will demonstrate how the project's objectives were realized. So they can include your number of participants, they can include a number of activities created, maybe your satisfaction rate, a potential number of partnerships, promotion and number of people reached. You can write down some statistics, some testimonies. Your indicator could also be transforming an environment, or maybe a number of orders, a number of new users on an online platform. So all potential performance indicators. And it's important to know what your performance indicators will be before starting your project, so that you can make sure you compile and register that information as it's going on. For example, if your indicator is number of partnerships, well, you want to make sure you have those signed agreements beforehand to be able to present those to your funder. Same thing with testimonies. If you want to have testimonies and videos and recordings, you need to set up ahead of time your system to register and to record all of those things, so that you don't get to the end of your project and you realize that you haven't recorded any of your indicators. So that's a very important point to determine ahead of time, to put in place your system that will register and compile this information. Next little tip for your grant writing would be to try and do some storytelling. So we were saying, don't exaggerate, don't make stuff up, make sure the information is clear. Yes, it's also important for the funder to be able to imagine the project happen. You have to be able to incite the funder to believe in the project. It's important for them to believe that it will transform society and that it will be beneficial for the community. So by doing so, you want to not exaggerate, but you want to make it more inviting to come and support your project. You also want to place the jury in a situation where the concrete results appear as a success. So you want to use your measurements and your results to demonstrate the success that you have had in your project. You can also mention how you can compile feedback and testimonies, and that will demonstrate the significant impact in the life of your participants, and funders will love that. You also want to keep in mind the project selection criteria. So after the admissibility evaluation, the applications will then be evaluated based on certain criteria. So knowing those criteria will maybe allow you to divide your time in a more efficient manner as well. For example, these criteria are really based on the bilingual Ottawa program. These are our criteria. It's not the same for every funder, obviously. But for example, in this situation, since there's a 10% attributed to the feasibility of carrying out the project during the COVID-19 crisis, and it's worth 10% of your score, I wouldn't take more than 10% of your time on it when you're writing. It's really important to consider that percentage and consider how, consider where you can go and get the most points to give your application the best chance of being funded. You also want to keep in mind your originality and your innovation for your project, because when a funder receives over 100 applications, the projects that are creative, that implicate social innovation, that have sustainable change will really stand out right away. So you want to make sure you make a link between the pertinence and the originality of your project. Make sure you think out of the box and try and inspire yourself from other success stories. Also, when creating your project, make sure you come up with an original name, and you propose a strong marketable brand. We can't ignore the fact that in today's day and age, everything needs to be marketable, everything needs to be easily accessible. So by having that in mind when you're creating your project will also help maybe have a catchier name, a catchier promotion system. So all things to keep in mind when writing your application. You also want to captivate the attention of the jury with your text. As mentioned earlier, again, do some storytelling. Try and make it very insightful, make it interesting, and try and pique the curiosity of the jury. A quick side note for artists and private enterprises. So since you're in a bit of different situation than a nonprofit, it's important to adapt to the reality of grants. So keep in mind that the projects should aim for direct participation. Don't try to promote your own artistic pieces or commercial activities. These funds are really for the development of the community, of bilingual initiatives and having a bigger space in the community. So when it comes to promoting our own activities or our own things, there are other grants for that. There's other funds. The funds for this is really to put in place a project that can help you maybe create better links or create a better hold in your community. You should also try and include the sharing of experiences and reinforcing the community through knowledge. And you also want to try and aim for investing in external sources, not yourselves. The sixth step is collaboration. So a project needs to collaborate to grow its space in a community. So you want to try and find yourself some key collaborators based on the amplitude of your project. The partnerships need to bring credibility to your project. So make sure that the partnerships you bring in aren't just your friends. Make sure that they have a reason and that they will be implicated in the development of the project. And you also want to confirm the partnerships with personalized letters. It will also then demonstrate the community interest in your project to the funder, which will raise your chances. And that leads us to the budget. So the budget is really crucial to validate the management and capacities of an organization. When evaluating a project, if there's a small mistake, a doubt, or an inconsistency, your project could be refused based on that. So you want to make sure that your revenues are equal to your expenses. You don't have to, but you should contribute a 5 to 10% investment in your project. Even more is better. Don't exaggerate on the salaries. You will have to keep them under 70% of the total costs of the project. And you want to try and cap your administrative expenses at 10, max 15%. So clearly explain each expense line. Don't overestimate the costs in order to acquire more funds. However, if your project is of a high impact and a high amplitude, don't hesitate to ask for larger amounts. Just don't exaggerate on the amounts that you are needing. After your budget, you've got it written, your budget's ready, your ideas on paper. It's a great chance to do your review before submitting it all. So it can allow you to also ameliorate certain elements that we might have lost throughout the writing of the grant. So when you're reviewing, try and avoid typos and grammar mistakes. Have your application reread by a member of your team, your board, your community member, etc. And try and avoid repeating yourselves and consistency errors. It's important that if early in the application you mentioned you're going to have 12 partnerships, and then later on you're explaining the partnerships and you've only mentioned 10, that might have a cause for concern on the review. So make sure that your consistency is there. Also want to respect the word limits and remove useless information. Every word that's there should have a beneficial impact and be informative to the jury. So make sure that you're not just adding information to hit the max word cap. Also, don't be afraid to follow up with the funder during your review if you have some final questions before submitting. This is really your chance to get it right. After that, we're talking about submitting the application and following up. So that's 9 and 10. So it's suggested to send your application a week before the deadline. So this will demonstrate your organizational capacities, as well as if there are mistakes, if there are changes to be done, you have a chance to do it. So many applications are submitted last minute and are written in a rush, and it does have an impact. You can see who rushed to write their project last minute, unfortunately. So make sure before you do that, you have your documentation in the right format. Make sure you receive a confirmation that your application has been received once it's been sent. You should receive an email or a message somehow. If not, you want to follow up with the funder. You also want to avoid bothering the funder with too many IT questions. Yes, it's a virtual platform, so there will be questions in regards to the technological aspect of it. But you can't expect a funder to be able to have infinite amount of time to help you log in and log out and do all your setups. Because if we were to do that with everybody, unfortunately, the funding would never be given out. So try to figure out the IT issues yourself. If there's a problem with the specific platform, feel free to contact the funder. They'll be pleased to help you with that situation. And then about a month or two after your application, you want to follow up with your funder without being too persistent. I would say once every month until you have a concrete answer is a reasonable amount. So that covers the 10 steps of applying for funding. So we have one last webinar left, which will be on March 18th at 2 p.m. So we'll be discussing the implementation of a successful project, as well as what common mistakes are made. So I hope today was informative. For those who participated in the original webinar, you might notice that this is a different recording. Unfortunately, the webinar session did not record properly, so we decided to redo this video to have it available on various platforms. So if you have any questions again about today, feel free to contact me at ottawabilingue@acfoottawa.ca. And I will be very happy to answer all your questions. Again, March 18th for the next webinar. Hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.